So we are nearing the quarter mark of the 21st century, and I thought it was a perfect opportunity to sit back and take stock. So I enlisted the help of several of my favorite booktubers, and I asked them, what is the greatest fantasy novel of the 21st century? I love the variety of responses. I love how some content creators just pick their favorites, and then I love that some of them tried to circumvent the rules and come up with their own answers. And I just love all of the answers today. Additionally, there are about 20 books that we're going to hear about here, and I thought that from 20 responses, I would get 10 responses about Storm of Swords, but that's not the case. I don't think a single book is talked about more than twice on this video. So sit back and enjoy all of the content creators talking about some of the greatest books of the 21st century in the fantasy genre. I will save my response for last. Here we go.
Hey, what's up, bookworms? Josh hit me up and asked, Mike, what is your favorite fantasy book of the 21st century? And this was a tough one for me, but I think I've got to lean towards my favorite fantasy series that started during that time period, and that would be The First Law, and I'm going with The Last Argument of Kings as my favorite in that series. And I think the reason it's book 3 here is because you had the culmination of all these different characters that were completely on different walks of life, their culmination of what they were going to become in this world, this cruel and punishing world. And I think about a third of the way into the story, there is such a twist with one of the main characters that I never ever expected, and it just turned the last 2/3 of that book on its head in a way I never expected. But really the reason that this one sticks with me is I hadn't really ventured into grimdark very much when I read this one. And the ending completely, I don't know if I was expecting a happy ending or what. I wasn't really versed in this stuff yet. And I just slammed the book down. I was so frustrated with the ending. And then even almost a year later, the ending was still in my head. And I started thinking about it, reassessing it, and being like, actually, you know what? That ending is quite brilliant. So I felt like it was my taking my medicine moment. And now it's just kind of formed the way of what I want all grimdark fantasy to be. So Last Argument of Kings, without a doubt, this is the one that had really just sticks with me the most.
Thanks for asking me to be part of this, Josh. There have been so many amazing books written in the last nearly quarter century. Some of them I'm currently reading but have not yet finished. So I'm going to go a little bit off the beaten track today and talk about one that I consider to be a masterpiece, one that I don't hear talked about quite as often anymore. It's part of an unfinished series, unfortunately, but it functions very well as a standalone, and that is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is a masterclass in fantasy storytelling, blending the gritty underworld of a crime-ridden city with the razor-sharp wit and intricate cons. Like, imagine Ocean's 11 set in a richly detailed Venetian world, where the protagonist, Locke Lamora, isn't just a thief, he's a master of deception. But at the heart of the novel, it also offers one of the best depictions of found family and friendship in a modern fantasy book that I've ever read, making it a truly refreshing read. Scott Lynch's world building is immersive, with a city so alive you can almost smell the salt air and feel the tension in the back alleyways. The characters are complex, the plot is full of twists, and the dialogue crackles with dark humor. If you love character heists, rich fantasy settings, characters who blur the line between hero and villain, The Lies of Locke Lamora is a must-read.
Best book of the 21st century so far? That is not an easy question. Josh, I love how when you reached out you said, easy question, easy answer, and then dropped one of the hardest questions to answer. I thought long and hard about this, okay? I was gonna put Malazan, Book of the Fallen, but then I got to thinking, and this book isn't even necessarily my favorite, but I do think it is one of the best books of the century so far, and that is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This book truly is so inventive, so unique. It is a breath of fresh air in the fantasy genre. Jemisin she was the first person that won 3 Best Novel Hugo Awards in a row for each book in the Broken Earth series. Obviously, she's doing something very right. It's a groundbreaking blend of high fantasy and dystopian, and it deals with a lot of themes of oppression and environmental disaster, stuff that's very relevant to today. The themes, the characters, the emotions, the prose, all of that. It's so good. And this isn't just good fantasy. This is like peak literature.
Hi, I'm Nikki, the Obsessive Bookseller, and my pick for the best book of the 21st century so far is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This book is on a pedestal. It had the perfect combination of everything for me. A lot of action and excitement, exceptional character work, some of the most evoking writing I've come across. It's absolutely superb. There's not a wasted word on the page. Every single sentence either develops character or it makes the world more rich. And on top of that, it has this brilliant dark humor that just adds so much balance to the story as a whole. It's an extremely creative take on a classic storyline, made all the more interesting by where it lines up in this first law world. My only caveat, read it like a book 4 in a series that takes a tangent rather than as a standalone. I think it benefits strongly from getting used to Abercrombie's style in the first trilogy. So that's my pick. Thank you so much, Josh, for including me.
What's the best fantasy books of the 21st century? Well, I'm not really sure why Josh thinks that I'm someone that can adequately give an answer to that. But the book I would... Sorry, that's the wrong book. The book or series I would highlight is The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. Now, I talk about this series quite a lot on my channel, and I often say that I think The Dandelion Dynasty, the whole quartet, is probably the most underrated piece of literature in the fantasy genre at the moment. Not only is this series one of the most ambitious series I have ever come across in the genre, but it is so incredibly unique, thought-provoking, has some of the greatest character arcs, and the world building is just top tier. Genuinely, if you want to read something that pushes the limits of what fantasy can be, then you need to check out Dandelion Dynasty. Thank you so much, Josh, for having me.
I'm Ben from Books with Benghis Khan, and the best fantasy book of the 21st century is A Brightness Long Ago by Guy Gavriel Kay from 2019. This is a historical fantasy set in an alternate version of Renaissance Italy, and it just utterly blew me away from the first page to the last with its elegant prose, its poignant reflections, electric, crackling dialogue, and so many tense, memorable, gripping sequences. Some of my favorite chapters I've ever read, like a horse race chapter that happened right in the middle of this book. Just absolutely stunning. The dance of POVs that happened in this book just gripped me so much and compelled me, and really just had me connecting to it on a deep personal level with themes about the kind of looking back at earlier moments in our life and treasuring certain great memories or thinking how things might have been different. And that feeling of nostalgia is something that really resonated with me. And Guy Gavriel Kay writing recently, he's still got it. This should have a much, much wider readership and more buzz about it, since it is a masterpiece.
Hello, Josh. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the book that I consider to be the best published fantasy in the 21st century. And this was one I didn't even have to think about. My answer is The Crippled God by Steven Erikson. This is book 10 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Not only is it the culmination of a series, the convergence of convergences, but it is where you see the full beauty and scale of Steven Erikson's exploration of such themes as what compassion means. This is just an incredibly sweeping, epic, vast, deep, moving, emotional experience. It is the book that I automatically think of when I think of what it means to be a human being. It is just great literature that transcends genre boundaries. I could go on, but I'm keeping this to about a minute for you. But The Crippled God by Steven Erikson.
Hello, we're Carlos and Yolanda from StoryToob. Thanks to Josh from Red Fury Books for inviting us to participate in this compilation booktube video. I believe the instructions provided to us booktubers was to select the best fantasy book of the 21st century. I'm unsure whether this is the best fantasy book of the 21st century or our favorite fantasy book of the 21st century.
Yeah, I'm not sure they overlap, but we agree on what we think the best fantasy book of the 21st century is.
And then we might provide our favorite. Are we breaking the rules, Josh? You let us know.
We both agree that the best fantasy book published in the 21st century is probably A Storm of Swords. Kind of difficult to top just in terms of achievement, impact, series overall, etc.
Influence on what modern fantasy looks like now.
Yeah.
Epic fantasy.
And what we expect from a fantasy novel. But speaking of expectations, I think we both have some slightly more unconventional picks for our favourite fantasy novel.
I think my favourite fantasy novel of the 21st century thus far is King of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. Mainly because it is not just a fantasy novel. It's also a sci-fi novel, a horror novel, intense literary character study, delving into the depths of a psyche of one character. It's great.
My favourite fantasy novel of the 21st century is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. On its own, and just look at it without its sequel or whatever's going on, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Thanks, Josh, for having us on and inviting us to answer this question that was more difficult than we thought it would be. And I hope you're not disappointed by our answers.
Hi, Josh. My pick is a little unorthodox, partly because I don't necessarily think it's the best of the past 24 years, and partly because it's only barely a fantasy. There are too many different kinds of fantasy for me to pick a single best one, so instead I'm selecting the work that had the greatest impact on me as a reader. Neil Stephenson's Baroque Cycle, published in 2003 and 2004, is a sprawling 3-volume, 2,600-page epic that's the greatest historical fiction novel I've ever read. It's set in the late 17th century and traces the emergence of modern ideas and philosophies in areas such as economics, finance, politics, and science. But it's not entirely historical. And the conflict the novel describes between the emerging scientific method and the prevailing beliefs in superstition and alchemy. Science doesn't have all the answers. Unexplained, fantastical elements play a small but pivotal role in the story, suggesting that perhaps the alchemists weren't entirely wrong. It's a challenging read, but highly rewarding, and I strongly recommend it.
Hi, my name is Evie, and my channel is She Was Only Evie. Josh has asked me to share my best book published in the 21st century. And to no one's surprise, that's going to be The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is a book that is a wonder and a feat of craftsmanship, of storytelling, of the genre of fantasy. And it's no wonder that I absolutely adore it, and I think it's the best book published this century so far. And it's really going to be really hard to top, I think. And because I cannot follow rules, I have to have honorable mentions. So, Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb, the last book in the Realm of the Elderling series, as well as The Stone Boatman by Sarah Tolmie. This is a standalone literary fantasy novel. And yeah, those are my best, and also happen to be my favorite. So thank you, Josh, for including me on this, and I can't wait to see what everybody else has in store.
Hey Josh, thank you so much for having me on your channel, and in my opinion, the best fantasy book of the 21st century so far is The Crippled God. This is book 10 of Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, and you know, this is not only my favorite book, but it's my favorite series as well. So naturally, when a last book just knocks it out of the park and just pulls in everything in such a perfect way, it's going to go down as one of my favorites. But it goes down for my favorite because all of the themes that have been building up in this entire series finally come home in just the most perfect, most epic fashion. And by epic, I mean literally some of the most epic moments that I've ever read about fantasy exist in the last few hundred pages of this book. It's wonderful, it's over the top, it's perfection, and hopefully I find another book in the 21st century that I like more than this, but there's a pretty good chance I don't, and you know what? That's okay with me. So thanks again, Josh, and really appreciate being on your channel.
Hello folks, it's Usman from Bards and Books, and I'm here to talk about my favorite fantasy novel of the 21st century. This is a bit of a tough one to narrow down, but I got it down to one book, and that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, which came out in 2022, I believe. Now, this is a fantasy story like no other. Very unique. The author takes a lot of risk, and it pays off so well. Different narration styles here, a very unique structure like nothing I've ever read. It all just blends together into this 5-day journey that will have you cheering and crying and experiencing emotions like you've never experienced. I definitely recommend The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. One of the best books of the 21st century, at least, and one of my favorite reads of the last year.
Wow, Josh, thanks so much for including me. What a question. The most important fantasy book of the 21st century. Hard to believe we're 25 years in already, but I guess we are. Look, I have to go a whole series because let's face it, it's fantasy. We love us some series. And I've got to go with Harry Potter. Now, not the whole series, but this series wrapped up in the early 21st century. So, what a fervor it was. Remember, we lined up. It was like a huge box office blockbuster opening, except in bookstores. People dressed up, people lined up, people of all ages, and kind of fervor we haven't seen since when Dickens sent new installment. I don't know. The kind of fervor we haven't seen since. And why? An entire generation found the fantastical. An entire generation of readers was created. An entire generation started to identify and understand themselves by imagining what house they would be sorted into. They started seeing magic in their own world because it was a reflection of Harry's world and the magic that was existing there. They could see magic in their own world. It changed their lives going forward. And it continues to change generation after generation because people keep discovering it. This series absolutely, I believe, will stand the test of time. There's absolute magic in these pages, lightning captured in a bottle, and many, many, many years in the future, this series will be held up and talked about with some of the greats in the genre. And that's why I think this has to be right up there, arguably one of the most important fantasy release of the 21st century.
Hey Josh, it's me, Britton, from Some Okie Dude. Thank you for inviting me onto this discussion on my favorite fantasy novel of the 21st century. Now, if a lot of you know me, you probably know what my answer is going to be, but I'll admit, this was both an easy and hard list to put, or a hard pick to put together because, for one, it's really easy because I know what my pick is going to be, but also it's really hard because there's some other books that I could have chosen for this occasion, like The Vor from Brian Catling, or Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James, or Perdido Street Station by China Mieville, or even Susanna Clark's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I just completed recently, and also Piranesi from the same author. It was really hard on that occasion because I thought maybe those books also needed some shout-outs because I think those books are also really good, some of the finest fantasy novels of the 21st century. But, of course, I cannot leave this book out. It is American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which is not only the best fantasy novel of the 21st century, at least in yours truly's opinion, but my favorite fantasy novel of all time. This novel is, I've talked about it a lot, so I'll try and keep this brief, but I don't know how well that's going to go. But it's an odyssey about America. It's also a reflection on why we are so drawn to belief and why we believe in things that some people might consider crazy, such as mythology or religion. How myth relates to culture and how myth relates to us, and how, really myths define our lives, really. And really few fantasy novels have really made magic and the fantastic really feel magical, but I really feel that American Gods is one of those novels that really brings that together. So yeah, American Gods is my pick for best fantasy novel of the 21st century.
Hey Josh, you asked me what was one of the most influential or best books of the 20th century now that we're about a quarter of the way through. And this was an almost impossible question for me to answer because there's so many amazing books. But I'm going to go with my recency bias on this, and I'm going to go with one that I just absolutely fell in love with very recently. That is Howard Andrew Jones, Lord of a Shattered Land. This is Hanna-Barbera Chronicles #1. Not only is this beautifully written, we've got a very strong character, but it's also got a very smart framing narrative, being a chronicle of a chronicle. Very cool. And basically what this is doing is it is taking sword and sorcery and modernizing it for, well, today's reader, and it does so beautifully. And I think this is something incredibly, incredibly special. Is it the best? We'll see.
This is Darko, Kindles and Kicks. Josh, if I could pick one fantasy novel to be the greatest in the 21st century so far, I would definitely have to pick Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. One, because this was the conclusion of a reading frenzy unlike anything seen before or since the Harry Potter series. And two, I felt like this was the official conclusion to my adolescence. Even though I had graduated high school and was in college at the time, I still didn't feel like an adult until Harry Potter had concluded, because it was such a pivotal part of my childhood. And when it ended, I was like, man, now it's really time to grow up. So yeah, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, greatest fantasy novel in the 21st century so far.
So I'm jumping in here because Jake Bishop is next, and Jake sent me 2 videos, and he asked me to choose between the 2. Well, he sent me videos about books from my 2 favorite fantasy authors, so I couldn't choose. So joke's on you, Jake. I'm going to put both of the videos here.
There's a 50% chance this is the video you see because I couldn't make up my mind. But this is going to be mine on why Lord of Emperors is the best fantasy book of the 21st century. It was published like 3 months into the 21st century, so you know the other 99 years and 9 months have a lot of work to do. But I consider Lord of Emperors to be one of the books that might be my favorite book of all time. The other was also published in the 21st century. You can figure out what the other one is by seeing what's missing on my shelf. It is the second half of the Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this is a historical fantasy series based in some like an alternate 6th century Byzantine Empire. This is a novel that simultaneously is about grand sweeping events that would whose effects would be felt for centuries and even millennia to come, while also zooming in on the little people of the story and how there's so much that would be missed in a history book, and that the cooks and the people who create mosaics all have their own dramas and stories going on, and it's genius. The attention to detail is outrageous. The writing is just magnificent, and there's a chariot race in it that legitimately could be considered a spiritual experience to read. There's a 50% chance you never see this, because I can't decide, and I'm just making Josh pick for me. But you can figure out what the other options are based on what's missing on my shelf. But this is why Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb is the best book so far of the 21st century. This is partially because it's my favorite ending to a series ever, and the last chapter is my favorite chapter, and I love the entire book from start to finish, to a slightly less degree than the very end. But also just as a representation of Realm of the Elderlings that wraps it up, which what I consider to be the best story I've ever written. I have to tone down my love of Hobb because people will hear it, and then it's too lofty of expectations, and it could never live up to that if I'm just I started to reread this, and 100 pages in, I was just Hobb's just so clearly better than everyone else. What are we even doing here? But that is what goes on in my mind every time I reread it, and this book stayed with me for just an absurdly long time.
Hey everyone, I'm Nikhil with Shelf Esteem. I'm a composer, now booktuber. Josh, thank you so much for having me be a part of this wonderful video. I fell in love with Brandon Sanderson's work back in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. I started reading Mistborn, then I got into Stormlight Archive, and I read The Way of Kings, and I thought, what could top this? I mean, the character development, the world building, the focus on mental health issues and how it grounds these characters, and juxtapositioned against this kind of larger-than-life world of Roshar, a mystery element as well that starts to unfold over time. The second book, Words of Radiance, is even better than the first. This one is 100 pages longer, and I think the pacing is better. The character development is more compelling. Shallan's backstory is one for the ages for me. Kaladin's kind of deeper focus into his struggles with his mental health issues and trying to kind of conquer his depression, his inner battle and the outer one. Different chapters have, kind of diagrams of the plant and animal life, so you really feel like you get to know the sights, the sounds, the smell of this world. Number one fantasy book of the 21st century for me, Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson.
Konnichiwa, Josh-san. As I know you're a great admirer of Japanese culture, I've decided to answer your question today with a haiku, yes, in traditional Japanese 5/7/5 format. Let's do this. Blood on castle grounds. the man who played Argus Filch, made a Storm of Swords. Yup, we went with George R.R. Martin's Storm of Swords, of course I did. Arigato gozaimasu.
Before I reveal my choice for greatest fantasy novel of the 21st century so far, I just want to say thank you to all of the content creators that took time to send me a clip for this video. This has been a really fun collaboration, and I think all the viewers would agree. Viewers, I would love for you, if you don't already subscribe to all of their channels, check it out below. I have all their channels linked in the description. And I would love to hear your choice for greatest fantasy novel of the 21st century, whether you agree with one of us or you have a different selection. Put that in the comment section below. So my selection for the greatest fantasy novel of the 21st century so far is Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. Assassin's Fate is the conclusion of the Fits and the Fool trilogy and the conclusion of the 16 books that make up the Realm of the Elderlings, 5 interconnected series. And this is just the end of a grand journey. When we start the Realm of the Elderlings and we start the Farseer trilogy, we meet Fitzchivalry Farseer, and he's a young boy. And we see him again in the Tawny Man trilogy, and he's a man. And we see him in the Fits and the Fool trilogy, and he's an old man. And the end of his journey is one of the most emotional experiences I've read in literature. It's one of the greatest literary journeys I've ever taken. For me, the greatest fantasy novel of the 21st century is Assassin's Fate by Queen Hobb herself. Thank you again to all the content creators. Thank you, viewers, for putting your selections below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.